we are very fortunate. Today we are very fortunate to have an international and an internationally renowned scholar talk to us about something that's very, very important in our journey as scholars, as researchers. And you've heard me speaking very often about the importance of arguing your point. I've often said to you that when you write a paper, it's as if you've got your court appearance, you've got to make your argument, support your argument, and close your argument when you're writing any sort of reports, whether it's a thesis, whether it's a paper, whether it's an abstract. Argument is the way we sell our research. It's the way we say our research has been necessary, our research has covered a gap that was in the literature, our research has a big so what statement. It's going to contribute to things going forward. So I was meant to be giving this talk today, and in my research last week, I was looking for new materials so that I could develop a new talk. And I saw that Professor Badenhorst, who's an ex-South African, but who now lives on the east coast of Canada, near the Labrador Islands, and she's at Memorial University there. She has got fantastic YouTube materials. She sent me a list of her stuff. I'm happy to share it with everybody. In fact, go onto YouTube, look her up, and then just subscribe to her channel. Get the videos as they come through and have a look at what she's presented in the past. And when I took a flying chance, I thought, let me just see if she's available. She actually agreed to give today's talk. So I'm going to hand over to you, Cecile. And again, thank you so much for agreeing to do this live, because I also just asked, could I have permission to just present one of your talks? And you said, happy to do it live. So I'm really grateful. And I think all our students are going to thoroughly enjoy this afternoon. I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Colleen. I'm always happy to connect to South Africa in any way that I can, you know, always feeling homesick one way or the other. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you can all see that.
Yes, we can all see it clearly.
Good. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is arguments in research writing. And please, if you have a question, you know, if you want to interrupt, that's fine. Or if you want to leave it to the end, that's fine as well. So I've put together a little bit of a presentation on arguments, but there might be other things that you want to talk about as well. I agree totally with Colleen that what your reader wants to see is a strong argument. We tend to think, oh, wait, let me go through the presentation. Colleen mentioned my YouTube channel. I have lots and lots of videos on all sorts of things to do with writing, and particularly the literature review, if you're interested. And this is a picture of our new puppy, and it's going to be relevant because I'm making an argument about that. So what we'll do today is we'll look at arguments in research writing and then have a question and answer period, but you can ask questions throughout. So let's just look at the characteristics of arguments. Arguments are essentially opinions supported by evidence. And the more convincing the evidence, the more the writer will persuade a reader. And the more convincing the evidence, the more truth-like the argument becomes and the less opinion-like. So it's a continuum from opinion to fact. And the more evidence you provide, the stronger it becomes like a fact. And in academic writing, we write arguments because this knowledge is contested. You know, not everyone agrees on things. We all have different perspectives. So we write arguments to persuade people to our point of view. So here's an example of one argument. And I guess what I'm saying is that over time, you'll see this shift between something that started off as a theory or opinion, and then as more evidence is collected, so it becomes more fact-like. And I always remember this one of plate tectonics, because when I was at school, we were taught that it was a theory and that it was a new theory and that it hadn't been proven. And then, and now, of course, people talk about plate tectonics as if it's, everybody's known this. So as more evidence is collected, it becomes more fact-like. In the beginning, it's more somebody's idea or opinion. There are lots of examples through the history of ideas, and I'm sure you can think of plenty of examples of things that were known facts that have now become debunked, in a sense, because evidence has proved it wrong. What's important to understand about academic arguments is that you are writing to a particular audience, and that audience has particular values, and that's your discourse community or your discipline. So what counts as evidence in your particular audience will be different from what counts as evidence in another discipline. And one of the obvious ways to talk about this is to talk about qualitative and quantitative evidence. So if your audience is mostly quantitative, they value quantitative evidence. And if you provide qualitative evidence, then it's going to be harder to prove that is evidence. It's not impossible, but you have to do a lot more work. So thinking about your audience and what your audience values as evidence is an important part of developing a strong argument. That's not to say that you can't change your audience's mind, but it means that if you are doing research in a new area or a controversial area, you really have to stack the evidence. So you have to provide a lot of evidence in order to convince your readers to shift from thinking that what you're talking about is opinion to something that's more fact-like. Another thing to think about with arguments is that they always contain assumptions. Because we have to begin somewhere, there are always implicit premises on, that we're basing our argument on. And it's really important as an academic writer to articulate what that premise is, because you don't want your audience to undermine your argument by picking apart your premise. So if I make the argument, dogs make better pets than cats, the premise is that any other animal doesn't count as a pet. So my whole argument can be debunked if somebody attacks that premise. But if you understand what the premise is, then you can provide a counter argument. So thinking about the assumptions implicit in your argument is also quite important. The other thing I wanted to add here was something specific to writing, because when we argue verbally, we can do all sorts of things. We can shift and we can go back to a point. But in writing, arguments are systematically built. So they are systematically built all the way through a text. If you are making an argument in a proposal, then it's built in the introduction, all the way through, and then reinforced in the conclusion. And the same thing with sections and chapters. When we go through argument structures, I'll show you that a little bit more. But really what I'm saying is that the written argument needs careful attention to how it is developed in the paper. When you're writing a paper, you have lots of things that you're doing. You've got all this content, you've got your genre, if it's a proposal, what goes into the proposal, the different sections, you'll have all the information, the citations, and the argument is a layer that goes into the paper, and it needs to be looked at when you are kind of developing it and revising it. You need to focus your eye on the argument during one revision stage so that you have all the components of the argument in there. And what I would suggest is that you do the argument in a separate kind of layer. So you think about it separately to everything else that you've got. So you might have all your other information that you're putting together, and then you take a step aside and you say, okay, well, what is my argument? Let me, jot down what I think it is, what is the evidence, all those kinds of things separately, and then build it into your draft. So these are the basic components of an argument, and you may already know this. You're making a claim, and the claim is something that you've thought up. It could be your point of view, it could be something you believe, it could be something you've observed. You then provide reasons for the claim, and the reasons for the claim again could be from observations, from things that you've read, but it's information as to why you believe this claim. And one of the things about an argument structure that's really important to remember is that arguments are stronger when they have a logic and reasoning. And the reasons for the claim provide the reasoning and the logic. And then you provide evidence. And in academic contexts, evidence comes from two main sources: published research, and published research counts as evidence because it's been through the peer review system. So scholarly published research counts more. You could provide statistics, but peer-reviewed, scholarly published research provides stronger evidence. And then, of course, primary research, where you go out and you conduct research yourself, will provide evidence as well. That makes up the basic components of an argument. So here's an example. My claim is dogs make better pets than cats. And I might be making that claim because I've read that more households own dogs than any other pets. But for you to be convinced, I would need to provide you with the statistics or with citations showing that more households own dogs, even though there are more cats in the world. What I want to show you here is one argument structure, and I'm going to go through a couple of other argument structures as well. But this is the most common argument structure you will find in academic writing. Now, when you present an argument, you don't always present all the components, but this is the basic argument structure. And Stephen Toulmin was an academic in the 1950s. So the argument structure follows this kind of format. You make the claim, then you have a couple of reasons why, and he called it the backing and the warrant. But you don't need to worry about those words so much. All you need to see or recognize is that he's asking for several reasons why you've made that claim. And one of the ways to remember this is to use the words because or since. So dogs make better pets because, and then you give a reason. And since dogs make better pets, then another reason. So you're building that logic with these sentences of reasoning. So it's not just the claim. You're explaining why that claim is important and why you think that claim is worth looking at. Then you provide evidence, and the evidence is published sources or primary research. But the one thing about Toulmin's argument that is really important, and you'll see this in academic writing all the time, is including a counter argument to your argument. This is the kind of scholarly approach where we take a balanced approach to an argument, and really it's accommodating your reader or listener's objections. So if I say dogs make better pets than cats, all the cat lovers out there are immediately saying, no, that's wrong. So if I want my argument to be convincing, I have to take into account that objection. And then there are two ways of dealing with the objection. One is where you rebut it completely, where you stick to your argument and you create a counter argument and you explain why dogs make better pets than cats. The other is where you qualify the argument. And what that means, qualifying the argument, and this is what Toulmin actually argued. He said we should qualify the argument. Qualifying the argument means really listening to the objection, like seriously listening to the objection, and then modifying your arguments so that you take the objection into account. And that's an academic way of arguing. It's not really an oppositional way of arguing. So if we have a look at this example, The claim is the argument statement. Dogs make better pets than cats. The backing, and this is why the claim is important, because dogs are a popular pet worldwide. Warrant more information to connect the backing to the claim. Since more households own dogs than any other pets, dogs make better pets than cats. The evidence, and here I would provide support, so statistics, I would cite sources, I would conduct primary research. Then the rebuttal or the counter argument, which is the argument against the one being made. Cats are less maintenance than dogs, and the counter argument, if you want to remember it, begins with a but. So dogs make better pets than cats, but cats are less maintenance than dogs. It's sometimes very hard to think of the rebuttal, because if you are making an argument, you think, why do I need to include a counter argument? But it makes a much stronger argument if your reader knows that you have thought of possible objections to your argument. So if we look at the two ways to deal with counter arguments, the rebuttal is to acknowledge the counter argument, but then to provide a rebuttal and a strengthening of your arguments. So this is where you say, well, although cats are low maintenance, dogs make better companions, and the research overwhelmingly shows that more households own dogs, something like that. Or you can qualify your argument where you incorporate the counter arguments. Obviously, cats are a popular pet, and perhaps it's not a case of one being better than the other. So you can see there you've brought your reader around to your side rather than putting your reader in opposition to your arguments. Your objecting reader. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about, and this is one of the reasons why academic writing is so complicated, is that within a thesis or a paper for publication, we make multiple arguments. Some arguments are stronger than others, but all the way through, we are making arguments. So I just want to go through some of them with you, and within your own research, you can think about the kinds of arguments you're making. So the most important argument is about the research problem. And the argument you're making is that this is a worthwhile problem to research, and that it's something important for your reader, because your reader is always asking the question, why do I need to read this? And you are making the argument that it's important for the reader to read this about the research problem. So your whole project will be framed around that argument. That's your dominant argument. But you'll also be making arguments about the theory or the concepts or the definitions of concepts that frame your project. So in your literature review, that's one of the arguments or the arguments that you are making. You will be making arguments about why this methodology and not another methodology. So if you decide to take a case study approach, what does the case study approach bring to this project? What's your rationale for deciding on a case study approach? So you're developing an argument around the methodology. You'll also be developing an argument about the quality of data that you've collected, and that's your validity argument. So what you're saying to the reader is that I set up this really strong methodology that's in line with my conceptual framework. I went out and I collected this data. This data is valid because of all these reasons. I did these validity checks, all that kind of thing. You're also making arguments about your data analysis. So you're saying, I chose this data analysis strategy because it will provide me with the robustness for these reasons. So these are all smaller arguments that you're making within the paper or the thesis, but they are still arguments. You're also making arguments about the conclusions you draw. And what you're saying to your reader is, I've been through this whole study. You can see my methodology, you can see my data, you can see the analysis. Do you agree with me that these conclusions are valid? So you're making an argument about those conclusions. And then you're making an argument about the significance of your research, which is linked to the argument about the research problem. And all of these minor arguments are linked to the main arguments. And you might have other arguments that you're making, because of the type of research that you're doing or the discipline that you're working in. But the point is to think about these arguments, to think about the decisions you've made and the arguments you're making within that bigger argument. I want to just very quickly go through different types of arguments. And the reason for doing this is not that you would follow one kind of argument, but I think sometimes, we learn one type of arguments and we kind of stick to it. And really what I want to do is show you that there are different ways of arguing. You can use the Toulmin argument. You can use the Toulmin in conjunction with one of these argument structures. And you probably are more familiar with these kinds of arguments. But to show you that there are different ways of arguing and different ways of providing evidence. So inductive reasoning is the specific to the general, where you begin with an observation and then you build the reasoning and logic. You would develop a hypothesis and then draw conclusions. So for example, most of our snowstorms come from the north. It's starting to snow. The snowstorm must be coming from the north. Deductive reasoning is the general to the specific, and this begins with a major premise or claim. Again, you would develop a hypothesis for this because these are, the more common scientific arguments. You would conduct research, and then you would come to a conclusion. All of our snowstorms come from the north. Let's see if our snowstorm comes from the north. So those are kind of inductive and deductive arguments. Another very common argument in research writing is causal arguments. And I wanted to talk about this because it's something that I see often in my students' work, and I'm always steering them away from causal arguments. Now, if you're conducting experiments or if you're doing quasi-experimental research designs, then you might be thinking of a causal argument, but a causal argument is very difficult to prove. And it's difficult to prove because you are really linking one cause to one effect. And life is very complex, and your reader is immediately thinking about objections and saying, well, there could be other causes for this effect. So, working with correlations is much easier than working with causal arguments. But there's something in our nature, I think, that leads us to continually want to draw these causal arguments. And that's why I put it in here, to draw your attention to it. So that when you are thinking about your research, that are you thinking that this leads to that, or are you thinking that there's a good chance that this leads to that, because there's a difference in the two. So causal arguments will have lots of objections, and you would need to counter all the objections. And an example of this is students don't complete assignments, students study part-time while working full-time, and lack of time is the reason why students don't finish assignments. But your reader's thinking, well, there could be many other reasons why. So you need to think carefully. If you are making a causal argument, think carefully about the objections. The other type of argument that I wanted to introduce was a qualitative argument, which is much more dialectical. You wouldn't develop a hypothesis, because a hypothesis is really a conclusion that you set out to prove, whereas qualitative arguments are often framed around questions. And a qualitative argument might include, several arguments or several voices in there. The whole point is to engage with complexity and ambiguity. So, for example, why don't students complete assignments? Students don't complete assignments because of time. Many students study part-time while working full-time. But then when you conduct the research, you may conclude that although time was an issue, it wasn't the main issue, that there seemed to be other feelings of isolation or whatever it is, or lack of confidence. So there, what you're doing is you're opening up the claim and the argument, not looking for one particular reason, trying to build in complexity, trying to incorporate the ambiguity that you find in life. So it's a much more open kind of argument. It allows for more voices in there. So I'm not promoting any of these arguments except the Toulmin argument, because that really is the most common form of arguments, well, argument structure in academic writing. But really what I wanted to do was to show you that the way you can argue in different ways. And it's important to think about how you want to construct this argument. So how do you start? I mean, this arguments always seem to be very complex. How do you start building an argument into your work? So for me, it's important that you think about your argument as a pre-writing activity. So you don't think about your argument as you're writing the first draft, but you think about it long before that. And you get your researcher's journal or scrap pieces of paper or whatever it is, and work through all the arguments that you intend to make, beginning with the most important one, the argument around your research problem. And I would just jot down notes, okay, so what do I think I'm arguing here? And, if you've used free writing before, I would free write. And basically that is a mind dump where you set a timer and you say, what am I thinking I'm arguing in this paper? And you just write it down. Only you will read this. This is not for public consumption or for your supervisor. It's for you to work out yourself. What am I thinking here? Where do I think I'm going with this? And often you have a good sense of what it is. So free writing helps you to put it down on paper. You can also sketch. I think sketching is really important. Draw out a diagram of your claim, your warrant, your backing, and the evidence, and jot down notes next to it. You could also do this on index cards so that you can build it over time. You can keep adding to the index cards. And obviously you begin with your research problem, because that's the main problem for your thesis. And often you have a very good idea of what you're arguing, but it's really important to write it down and then to think through, okay, what am I assuming here? What is the premise that I'm basing this on? And go through the various components of the argument. So what I'm suggesting with this is a very loose, you're not judging yourself and saying, well, what's my argument? What's my argument? It's more an engagement with your thinking and saying, all right, let's write this down. What am I thinking? Is that what I want to go with? Is that the argument I want to develop? No, not really. That's not quite what I'm looking for. Okay, let me work on it a bit more. So it's these conversations with yourself, but through writing, and it's a pre-writing activity. By the time you get to writing your draft, you should have a fairly good idea of where you're going with this argument. And then use the Toulmin structure just to help you build that reason and logic, and go through all the different components of a thesis or a paper, like what am I arguing in the literature review? So what conceptual framework, what concepts? So what am I arguing in the literature review? What am I arguing in the methodology? What am I arguing in my, how can I be sure my data is valid? How does my data analysis strategy help me convince my readers? What am I arguing in my conclusions? And what is the significance of my research? So you go through all those different components. You might have a different page in your researcher's journal or a different index card, and you work through the different arguments in each of those using that Toulmin structure. Now, you may not use all the components of the Toulmin structure, but in your writing, but it's really helpful to help you think it through. then think about how you will systematically write that argument into your chapter. So what will you say in the introduction of the chapter? Where will you build the claims? Where will you provide the evidence? Where will you deal with the counter arguments? I mean, you can use the Toulmin structure as a structure for a paper or a chapter, but think about it systematically. And when it comes to writing, the introduction and the conclusions are very important in introducing the arguments and in creating resonance with your reader for the argument at the end. So, you know, that's what creates a coherence throughout the chapter or the paper. And another really good strategy is to actually talk your argument through to someone else, because they will come up with objections and then you can begin to think of counter arguments. Here's an article that you might want to read, and it's particularly, well, it's within the kind of health field. It's very easy to read and it outlines things quite nicely. So if you want to take this a bit further, then I would suggest reading that. And if you need it, I can always email it to you. And I have another video on arguments if you want to watch that on YouTube. Okay, any questions?
Thank you so much for that, Cecile. People, we've got Cecile for another 30 minutes. This is an opportunity of almost a lifetime, because I'm sure she'll come and talk to us again. But I would like to ask the students to really make use of this opportunity to ask Cecile any questions about particularly argument, but if you've got other questions regarding research, use this opportunity to speak to her. So just unmute yourself and ask your question. Some people can't use the reactions. I know I was driving yesterday listening into a meeting and I couldn't use the reactions. So just unmute. I'd like to, Cecile, just make a comment that I have found it very difficult to teach and to explain argument in a purely descriptive study as opposed to a study where there's a hypothesis. So we've got one student here whose work I actually used as exemplary for argument. It's Antoinette's work, where she said her method of treating a particular pathology is better than the traditional method. And she put such a good, strong argument through intuitively, because she wrote that paper long before I even started teaching argument. But we kept saying we have to get the reader to understand where we're going with this. It was controversial, and that made us make a strong argument. But if we've got a paper, a student who's writing a paper on what do the injuries look like in pedestrian accidents in children, when it's purely descriptive, it's quite hard for them to think that there's an argument, because they just say, but I'm just telling them what's happening. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so is the study based on secondary sources or primary sources? Because if you're arguing something descriptive from secondary sources, then what you are showing is other people who support your argument. So you're saying, I'm arguing this, but others do too. So you're providing all the studies that support your argument in this particular way. So, you know, if you're doing a primary study, then you're actually going out and collecting data and you're saying, look, here's the data to show this. But if you're doing a kind of literature review, then you're showing the studies that support your argument. So it sounds like it's not as convincing because you're not providing the data, but those studies have gone out and collected data, and you are piggybacking on them, basically.
Yeah, so just to clarify, I'm giving you an example of what would be a typical MEd study, which is descriptive usually. The student will go out and collect the data on injuries, it might be prospective, it could be a retrospective study, but they could be going into the trauma unit every time they get called in for, say, for example, a child pedestrian accident. They're only looking at children. So what I usually say to them, and either you can tell me I'm right or wrong, is that when they are describing their data, that's their data, it's primary data. But whenever you write a paper, you have to use secondary data to support what you're looking at. You're going to be looking at pedestrian accidents in all over the world. And are they different in our countries? Are most of the pedestrian accidents with children here with cars? Are there other pedestrian accidents with other forms of transport? I mean, I think in India it might be with motorbikes, little scooters, etc. So whereas in Anto's paper, it was very easy to argue, this is how I treat this pathology, this is how the rest of the world treats it, I get much better results. Easy argument.
Yeah.
But if a student's just going to go out and collect the data on accidents, then they find it difficult to argue.
So there are a couple of things. One is to relook at the problem, right? Has the problem been well articulated? Because if the problem is very broad, then you're making multiple arguments within that. And that's when it gets complicated and complex, and where you're shifting from one argument to another. Where the problem is quite refined, you'll find it's easier to make an argument. But sometimes you might be making an argument for complexity. So that's where you're saying, you know, a lot of studies think that A leads to B. But what I'm arguing is that actually it might be much more complex than that, and then you open it up. But your point about secondary sources is really important, because what you're talking about there is that building of the logic of the argument, because you're saying, this is what I think, that's my claim. But look at this study showed this, that study in that country showed that. And so you're building this, where you're convincing your reader, you're building this mass of information from other studies, so that your reader's saying, well, I didn't quite believe your claim, but after hearing this and that and that and that, I can see why you're making this claim. So the more controversial your topic is, the more you have to provide that information. The more people understand what you're saying, the less evidence you have to provide. But secondary sources are really important, because they confirm that what you're saying is important, because you're saying, okay, I know I'm thinking this, but have a look at everybody else who's thinking this as well, and all the studies that have been conducted. There's a question there.
Okay, go ahead. Hello?
Richard, do you want to ask your question?
Is that me, Colleen?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh,
yeah,
right. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to comment, because that's such a good question you asked, and so important. And I find that with the MMeds, a lot of the problem is that they just don't realize that once they've got their data, they can make arguments. There's very little point in doing a study if you can't make an argument on the results, even if it's descriptive. Let's say, for example, that pediatric trauma, you found that the girls fell out of trees and the boys fell off bicycles. Well, then you'd make an argument that there is a case why girls fall out of trees rather than bicycles and boys the other way around. And you would extend that argument as to why different levels of intervention are required, therefore, to safeguard boys' health versus boys' health, girls' health, and so on. And often the students need guidance there. They don't see for themselves that they ought to be looking for these arguments in their data. And the second thing, I often try to persuade them, very often they could come up with a much better research topic or question if they actually foresaw what the arguments might be before they did the descriptive work.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the problems with developing arguments is that we are trained into seeing knowledge as facts. So when you look at, look at the data, you're looking at it as fact. Like this is what we have to absorb. And really our schooling system right around the world is all based on absorbing facts. So changing that to saying, well, that's what somebody argued, or that's a point that somebody put forward, can be quite a difficult kind of transformation. But I think just realizing that we don't have facts, we have arguments, and the history of ideas is full of these facts that were then proven wrong. So thinking about knowledge as argument, then you begin to see, okay, I've got this data, what can I say about the data, but what is the data telling me as well, right? It's quite, I think it's quite a difficult shift, especially in the sciences, because the sciences are supposed to be all about objectivity and about truth and about, these incontrovertible things. So to say, well, I'm making an argument, almost it counters that whole way of thinking. And in the sciences, sometimes arguments are quite muted. So when you read papers, although an argument's there, it's presented in a very fact-like way. So sometimes when you're reading papers, you'll say that there's no argument in this paper because it's so subtle. But really everything you're doing when you write a paper is an argument. The fact, what you've chosen to write about, what evidence you've presented, how you've decided to write that, all of that is an attempt to persuade a reader. That's what you're trying to do. But sometimes it looks like it's very fact-like. And I think that can be confusing. Sorry, there's another question.
Yeah, Shamila, is that you? I know there are two galaxies, and I know Shamila is one of them. Is that you with a hand up?
That's right, Prof. Colleen. Thank you so much. Prof. Cecile, thank you. This is really, really a lifetime of a moment. And I'm not going to let it slip me by. You're describing this argument so in detail. I'd just like to find out how, at times, students become so winded down, especially in the lit review, when they're looking at arguments and trying to get their voice.
Shamila, I think we've lost you. I think she might have just gone off. As soon as she comes back, Shamila, we lost you for a few seconds.
Oh, sorry, I'm not sure where you have lost me, but basically I want to know, how do you keep the golden thread, spinning through the intensity of all the arguments that you're trying to make your voice or your research out there? Thank you.
I'm not quite sure I got the question. Are you saying, yeah, I missed it. Sorry, with the coming and go. Can you maybe just repeat it?
Yeah, I'm just gonna quickly just wind it down. What I'm saying, Prof, is how do you keep the golden thread flowing through the intensity of your arguments, but at the end of it all, you're getting your voice through all the evidence that you're putting out there. Yeah, like you're describing a dog is, a much better household pet versus the cat and whatever. Yeah, so that's my question. Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's why I'm arguing that before you start writing, you need to think about these arguments. Although you can think about it through writing, you can think about it through writing notes or in your researcher's journal. But if you're saying to yourself, okay, what am I arguing about my research problem? What stand am I taking? So if my research problem is, more households have dogs, but they don't look after them, then where do I stand? Because that's a problem, right? Where do I stand on this? My argument would be, well, maybe there needs to be a vetting process before people can get dogs as a pet. So so working out what your point of view is about the problem is the number one place to start. Then you can go through the different sections of the paper. So, why is this a problem? And working that out for yourself. Why is this worthy of being researched? And you can just work it out in your own language. And even if you don't write it formally, you'll notice that when you come to write that chapter, because you've thought it out, it will be much clearer in your writing. When it comes to, let's take a paper, but it's the same thing with a thesis. When it comes to the literature review, what you're looking at is what concepts will help me understand this problem. So if we're looking at the pets, what does it mean to be a pet? What does being a pet owner involve? So those are the concepts that you've decided to select and interrogate because you think they're important. And then you might come up with the conclusion that in order to understand this problem, we need to develop a new concept, which is, an amalgamation of other concepts, and that will help us understand this problem. So you're making an argument for doing that. Then when it comes to the research, you're saying, what would be the best way to collect data? Or there is this data out there, what would be the best way to understand this problem with the data that I have? So you're making an argument about the data, and you're saying, well, if there's data out there, then these streams of data will help me understand the problem. So you're making an argument about that. And this links to Richard's question in the chat box. To make your research convincing, you have to show the validity of that data in whatever way you can. If you're doing qualitative research, you would, there are all sorts of sources on validity of data, but you would go and do member checks, or you would do observations, or whatever it is. You have to build in the writing an argument about why that data is valid, even if it's just one paragraph. And then very importantly, and I think this is what you're talking about with your voice, is you need to draw conclusions. And often people don't draw conclusions, and it's in drawing the conclusions that you put forward your main arguments. But basically what you're saying to your reader is, have a look at this problem that I've set up as important, and have a look at the data I've produced, and I've shown you that it's valid. These are the conclusions I'm drawing from that. So that is the kind of reasoning and logic throughout the paper that leads to your final conclusions. And it's in the final conclusions that you pull together this argument. But obviously it's built in all the way through. Did you want to add something there?
Thank
Richard,
you so much.
have you got another question, or is that an old hand? Or another comment?
It's just a thumbs up, Prof. Thank you so much.
Okay, Shamila. Richard?
Old hand, sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Sorry, I was just going to add to Richard's comment in the chat box that really, when you're writing a paper or a thesis, keeping the reader's objections in mind all the way through is quite helpful, because the reader wants to know. I'm always asking this when I examine a thesis. I'm always saying, but why this methodology and not another one? So if you write, I'm going to do a case study methodology, then I'm thinking, well, why? Why have you chosen that? What makes this a valid, what will this get you? And that's what you have to build into your thesis or your paper.
We've got a question from Mpumelelo. Unmute and ask.
Thanks, Prof. Good afternoon, everyone. Prof, I just want to find out, I'm still learning. With regard to arguments, sometimes you support it with other people's work. So now, my question is, if my argument is supported by 5, for example, papers, and then I support it, then there are other 10 that are not supporting, that are opposite. So does that make my argument that is supported by 5 a weaker argument or not valid? So is there any valid or strong argument in terms of that without looking at methodologies? Let's say maybe methodologies are mixed in all these articles, and the settings are mixed as well. So there's like neutrality in terms of that, but it's just that the others, my argument is supported by 5, the other one is supported by 10. If it's supported by 5, does it make weaker or less valid?
That's a very good question, and I like the way you've posed it. And this is a typical academic way of doing things. So, so you would present your argument with the 5 papers that support it, and then you would also present the counter argument and the 10 papers that don't support it. And then you would have to explain why you still think your argument is valid. And you can either do that through referring to the methodologies or debunking the arguments that are against your arguments, or by providing new data. Right, so if your research provides new data, then you can say, although all these other studies, you know, have argued against this, my data shows this. Or you can say, although all these other studies argue this, they were set in different contexts, and in our context, this seems to be the case. So you find a way of arguing against it, and you strengthen your argument, but you need to take it into account, because otherwise your reader is going to be saying, but there are all these other arguments. Well, you know, what are you doing with them? How are you dealing with them? So you can still keep your argument, but you have to convince your reader somehow that your argument is valid.
Thanks, Prof.
Are there any other questions? I've got another one just to keep the intellectual conversation going. So interrupt me if a thought comes to mind. One of the things that's also very difficult for a novice researcher to grasp is that there isn't just one argument that you have to be making. And you touched on this in your talk, and I'm very grateful for that, because it kind of helped me now to explain it. You will have an argument in a research paper that is published that's 4,000 to 5,000 words. There, you also have a thesis, and there are. Just let me go back to the paper. There's more than one argument. There's an argument in your paper about your research question. There's an argument about the methods you use. There's an argument about what else? Kind of when you get to your results, you can pose more arguments. It's not just one argument around your research question. So when it comes to a thesis, you're going to see lots of arguments going through the thesis. But for an examiner, where do you think an examiner will be looking for the main argument of the thesis?
Yeah, I mean, this is what makes academic writing so complex, especially thesis writing or publishing, because of all these multiple arguments. And even within a problem, a research problem, you might be making like one main argument, but with a sub-argument, you know, so it could be more complex than just one problem, one argument. As an examiner, and I'm really talking about myself, although I have done some research on examining, the main thing that I want to see is an argument for the so what. So it doesn't really matter what your topic is, but you need to explain and articulate why this research is important. And that links to the significance, which you usually follow up with in your conclusion. Often by the time people get to the end of their papers or their projects, you know, they're tired or they've had enough of it, so they tend to kind of fade away at the end. But the end, particularly the conclusion, but the discussion as well, is really important, because that's where you are articulating why this research was so important. You set it up in the beginning, You go through it all and then you explain why in the end. So the so what is absolutely crucial. But then the methodology is the next part that for me, that's what makes your results valid, is your methodology. So if you don't provide a strong argument for why you're doing the research, or why you've set up the design the way you have, if you don't have a rationale in there, and you don't have a rationale for why the data is valid, like, what makes this data valid? So I could have a thesis where there's only one interview, where the writer or the researcher has said, I'm only doing one interview. But if that researcher has explained why it's valid to do that one interview and how that one interview will count as data, and why it's rich, and what they've done to make sure it's rich, and what they've done to ensure that they've met what they wanted to do in the study, then that can be convincing. So it doesn't mean that you have to have lots and lots of data. It's more a rationale about the decisions you've made. Why did I choose this methodology? Why did I decide on interviews or whatever the data collection methods are? It's that rationale that is important. I've done a lot of videos on the literature review chapter or section, because in a literature review, you make multiple arguments. You're making an argument for the conceptual framework, for the concepts being used, for the knowledge gap that this research will fill. So the literature review is a complex section because of all these multiple arguments being made. But yeah, the methodology to me is how that's argued would be a make or break on a thesis. Sorry.
For our theses that are by publication, what I tell the students, and you can either refute this or add to it, is that the main argument has to come through in your introduction chapter and your closing chapter, whether it's discussion and conclusions, or conclusions on their own after discussion, however you do it. I call them the bookend chapters.
Yeah.
That is where your examiner must see the whole argument. And every publication that builds the argument up through the thesis has its own argument, and you link the one argument to the next to show how it develops.
Yeah.
And then the students say, but there's so much repetition. And yes, there will be repetition, but it's how you repeat and the context of your repetition. You are making a claim before you do the research. You repeat your claim to show the evidence in your discussion.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. And I wouldn't call it repetition. What I would call it is building resonance with your reader. So, I mean, there are a couple of things you're doing. One is you're being kind to your reader by reminding your reader, this is my main argument, this is what I'm trying to do here. But then at the end, when you pull it all together, it's not just a conclusion, it's not a summary. It's where you're saying, this is what I've done, but can you see what I've done? Can you see how I've pulled this all together? Can you see how my evidence fits in with this argument? So it's not just a summary. The conclusions are so important. I mean, that's what stays in your reader's mind. Another way of thinking about this is to say, if my paper had to be cited, what would that citation look like? So it would be Badenhorst argues, and then what is it? So if you're writing a paper, put your name and argues what in that paper. And then hopefully that will highlight the most important thing you're trying to argue in the paper. And you can build that all the way through the paper. So if somebody's citing you, you don't want them to say, well, Badenhorst argues this and this and this and this and this. You want them to have something that they can hang it on.
Yeah. So I think I get this a lot from Richard, is have the devil's advocate with you the whole time.
Yeah.
And remember that you are going to be somebody else's devil's advocate at some point. And that's where you get to what your citation is going to look like.
Yeah.
We've reached our 1 hour. Last chance for anybody else to make a comment or ask a question. Okay, it looks like everybody is happy. Everybody stayed with us for the full hour. That just shows everybody was engaged. I learned a lot as well. Thank you so much, Cecile. And again, thank you for coming in at such short notice. I really appreciate it. And I think on behalf of the university, I'd like to thank you again. And I'd love to invite you several times, but I'll wait for you not to be in semester time. I'll make sure I get you during the back periods. Thanks.
I mean, invite anytime. I may not be able to come, but I love having these workshops, especially in South Africa. So thank you very much for the invitation, and lovely to see you all, and best of luck with your research.
Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for attending. We'll see you all same time, same place.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.